So Marco versus King, pretty widely debated topic right now still. So in this video, hopefully I can provide some clarity on the topic. I'm going to be breaking down both King and Marco's scaling to try to lead you to a conclusion at the end of the video. Thus, it's only right to first analyze their actual interaction in Wano. So first and foremost, we have to acknowledge is that Marco's already heavily fatigued coming into this. So he stated to have been fatigued from flying all the way to the island from wherever he was staying and then having to carry Cat Viper from his ship all the way up to where the scabbards are. So there's a statement about him being fatigued then. He then goes on to fly back, go get Sparrow, come back, fight with Big Mom. It wasn't a very prolonged fight, but there was an off-screen portion of it, and then there's still an exertion level that is used to fight with her, etc., that is going to deplete him in some capacity. So you have that, then you have him healing thousands of people with his flames, which is a named attack or named technique, mind you. Then you have him getting finally to King and Queen, who he takes on 2v1. You also get a statement in the midst of this as he was continuing to fight them 2v1 that this is very taxing and to try to hold off two people. Gets yet another statement of fatigue there, showing signs of fatigue, and then Sparrow makes claim that he looks very tired. So these are things that all have to be analyzed and acknowledged first and foremost. So when we get into it, we see that he starts things off by sending Zoro to the roof, and he's taking shots, beam shots from Queen, just obviously regenerating. It's not a big deal. It gets to a point where he's able to fly past them, grab both of the two of them, and still send Zoro flying up there, all with relative ease, like it wasn't a big deal, and those two could not stop this from taking place. You then have a situation where every time one of them tries to do anything, whenever Queen starts walking away, Marco ropes him back in, slams him with another attack, re-engages him, completely locking down these two while protecting other people that were affected by the Ice Oni virus that Queen was not giving them the antibodies for. So he was trying to buy time for Chopper to heal these people, also protecting them from some of the other shots that were being fired, the beam shots and other things from King. That's all what's happening here, whilst also having to fend off countless hordes of fodder that he deals with as well while dealing with King and Queen. You get to a situation where there's times where he's getting simultaneously attacked from both of them, which is really the only times where they're landing anything on him. There's never a situation where they're landing clean shots on Marco where he's on guard or anything. He always is able to react to them, and in the inverse, he's actually blitzing them. So he sends King flying with the bluebird, fully blitzes him in with the knee. As King knocked down, Queen starts walking over to him, blitzes the shit out of him with crane talons, has them going back and forth where they are getting frustrated at this point. They can't get past him. He is stopping them at every turn. It even gets to the moment where even when Queen again tries to walk away and starts firing on the people, this is right before Chopper pushing him. This is a panel that a lot of people overlook. Marco again restrains Queen, allowing for Chopper to land that initial punch. So Marco was buying time back and forth to where he could take out one momentarily and go give his full attention to the other for a period of time. Eventually it gets to a point where when Chopper goes Monster Point, they're all fighting in the same vicinity, mind you. He kind of just lets Chopper fight with Queen and kind of stays with King from that point on, but his stamina is already massively depleted by this point, and he continues fighting King off screen for a period up until Sanji comes to help, obviously, and he takes on Queen. Then even when Marco's battle quote unquote ends, so to speak, Oda specifically goes out of his way to specify that it was Marco's stamina that ran out. That's why it's so important that I highlighted all the parts where it's specified that he's already fatigued. He was never overwhelmed by their strength. He simply was tired, and he's just sitting by a rock someplace. We don't see anything else that happened, but that's what's highlighted, and the people that were all in the vicinity are corroborating this. And then even then, when they say his stamina is gone, he gets back up and blocks yet another attack from King when the situation was dire enough that Zoro was going to be attacked while pretty much incapacitated. And funny enough, he actually intercepts this attack from King before Sanji could even react and get over there. And this is also Sanji post using the raid suit, so the exoskeleton right here is already in the process of activating, and the exoskeleton is what gives Sanji his speed. Just putting that out there. He then proceeds to block an attack from Kaido later in the war, proving that he still had capacity to fight, and he does clean up around the island after this. He's never incapacitated or taken out. He was never incapable of defending himself either. So there's no metric to say this guy's defeated, and especially not defeated in any sense of a fair fight. Now, starting things off with King, there's a lot of discourse surrounding a scenario where like people think that like there's a drastic difference in King's speed in his flame on and flame off form. Zoro pretty much sums it up perfectly by saying he's a little bit faster. If you go back and even comb through these chapters, even when King uses his hybrid form, which is very rare, which theoretically should amplify stats, although we're not even going to get into the weeds on that, he's using hybrid times speed form, and Zoro was still capable of reacting. In this instance, and in most of the instances early on in the fight, it was never a situation where Zoro couldn't contend with the speed. It was always a situation where Zoro couldn't contend with the power, and that's why Advanced Conquerors took him over the edge. So we see that he reacts even to a hybrid king using speed form here, and this isn't even just a one-off occurrence. Hybrid form actually makes a return in the later chapters again from King, and Zoro again has a similar response where he's capable of reacting, reacts, puts his sword up to block, and is simply overwhelmed from the power. So this is something that we see. And even if we wanted to talk about this instance here, because some people like actually believe that this is some sort of a blitz from King, like where they argue that this is his fastest moment because he's using high speed movement where he goes invisible, like it's like the shave technique similar. It's what happens when characters move super fast. For one, you see the sound effect of Zoro clashing with the foot. That's the gank sound effect. And then you have it directly shown clear as day in the anime. He blocks it and then counterattacks regardless. Zoro clearly perceives him, right? That's the whole point. And then he launches a counterattack with pinpoint accuracy. That is 100% a reaction. It would just be a situation where it's like, okay, I'm baiting him in with the speed form. I'm going to attack him. I am pinpointing exactly where he is. I know where he is exactly, and I am reacting in kind, be able to land my attack before he can put his Dura back on. And he almost uses the momentum as an advantage to hit King. So no, a blitz would be the character cannot react in any capacity. You can't launch a counterattack if you're getting fucking blitzed. And you can see many instances where King, even in his flame on form, is capable of reacting to Zoro. He has very similar reactions, just slightly faster. And Zoro's pretty much always able to react to any version of King. Zoro, when he gets hit, is usually set up by like Enma distracting him at a point, or like I said, he does react, he just gets overwhelmed with the power, which makes sense with the speed anyway, because speed obviously equates to having more force on your attacks as well. You also see that Zoro is able to blitz speed form King with his Lion Song the same way he was able to blitz Dura form King. Now the Dura form one, maybe you say like, well, maybe he didn't want to take the attack, but there's no excuse for the one without the flame, so I would assume that it's the same for both. And it's a pretty similar situation, and even Dura form King can still contend with Zoro, like I'm saying. So the fact is, if a character is capable of blitzing flame on King, I don't see any evidence supporting that they wouldn't still be faster than a flame on King. At least especially in a combat sense, especially given that King, has to build up a lot of speed from flight anyway. If we just take Zoro, for instance, like I'm saying, Zoro's reaction is very, very similar. So that's going to be a thing that needs to be established early on. Now, also, I've given you guys the definition of what speed blitz is, via Burst's Battle Wiki, at least their definition of it. So I think it's in fairness to say, like, I could contest a lot of the terminology I use for blitz for Marco and Zoro over King. Honestly, I think it's more consistent to probably just say that they're outpacing him. If you look at the situation with Marco, so yeah, he lands the fireball thing, but it's looking like, King is kind of just backing away, and then he gets hit with the attack, and then he's kind of caught within the radius of it, and then when he looks up, he's completely taken by surprise that Marco is coming for a follow-up attack that he clearly wasn't paying attention to. As far as the Zoro situation, the first one, you don't actually get a clear shot of what happens before this, so you don't know if there was any reaction, you don't know even really what set it up. All we know is that, like, the one chapter, Zoro awakened Advanced Conquerors, we cut away, we cut back, and then he did this attack, so we don't get to see that. So you could kind of dismiss that via Hitch and Razor, say like, hey, you can't really specifically tell me what happened here, and it is kind of inconsistent given that, King really maintains a relativity in speed to Zoro even in the final moments of the fight. They clash multiple times, they contest each other, and even the final interaction with Dragon Damnation, which should theoretically be faster than any attack Zoro had output before this, you could argue that King was caught off guard by the fact that Zoro could Flame Rend, which is a technique that's a very specialized technique, nuanced technique that Kinemon uses that Zoro took from him that he had never displayed prior to that against King. The King would not know he had. And you could make a case that King actually still reacted to the attack as the sword was cut, indicating that he actually put the sword up to contest it. He simply was overpowered, as it's very clear that he perceived the attack that was coming his way. So I would say that it is most consistent to say that Marco and Zoro are both outpacing King consistently, but I've already proven that the speed form and the Dura form, there's not a vast gap in speed. So I would say, like, even if King got relative with the speed, he's having to put himself at a disadvantage, whatever the case, but I wanted to make that clear. Now, the reason I bring all this up is because King, when he's fighting with Marco, is in his flame on form, not his speed form. So they try to use this to say like, oh, well, maybe he's faster than Marco, but it's a situation where he's blitzing speed slower than Marco in his flame on form. So it only makes any logical sense that he should be needing to use speed to keep up with Marco if it's a legit 1v1 fight. And that might be what's happening in the off-screen interactions, given that they were saving these things until the Zoro fight where you really get to see it in its full glory. So that's also a possibility. Also, somebody might say like, hey, could it be a situation like, does King simply just not want to dodge these attacks because he doesn't see any reason to? I don't think that there's any reason to believe that. Every time Marco does anything to King, whether it be choking him, which honestly you could say that there's a win count where Marco could choke King out. His eyes go wide when he's getting blitzed and hit with these attacks. He's surprised. I touch on this at the end of the video as well, but all the context clues would tell us that that's not the case in this instance, and I would just say Occam's razor would apply. Now it's a situation where it's like, did Marco actually show capacity to damage King? There's one thing that's stated where it's like Queen is basically saying that Marco has a shockwave ability. Now, if he has a shockwave, he should have some form of dur negation via shockwaves. It's never overtly confirmed, but I think we can deduce that it's more than likely true, given that Oda's giving us the context clues for it, and Queen is taking substantial damage from it, at least to a point where he's saying it hurts, and he's questioning whether it is a shockwave or not. It also seems that when Marco does land these attacks on King, they affect him in some capacity, where it obviously has enough force to blow him back, but it's also a situation where when King is slammed into the wall, as I said before, these things are inhibiting him enough to where Marco can go back and restrain Queen. It leaves King slow to get back up in a sense. You could also argue that there is drops of blood coming from his face. Now, this was kind of expounded upon when they gave us the official digital colored version, which does show red droplets coming from his mouth, kind of in some way confirming that that could be blood. Now, some people don't like to take the digital colored panels. Also, it is a little inconsistent given that when Zoro and Sanji do the Stars Take Aim chapter where they do their double attack and hit King and Queen, the same thing is illustrated as blood there for King, and we know that Zoro was not capable of damaging King at that point, especially flame on. It shouldn't be possible, and it's contradicted by Zoro's dialogue later. So that could lead you to a couple conclusions. Is it just a situation where this is something that Oda retconned within the same arc where, you know, he's making it seem like blood, but then he's like, oh, it actually wasn't blood, so it's a fake out of sorts? Or is it a situation where just an inconsistent drawing? Now, what I would say is that I think that the fake out type thing makes a lot more sense for the Zoro and Sanji situation, especially given that like Queen says that they didn't even feel the attack afterwards, and King's face is completely unfazed by the attack when they get knocked down. As far as the Marco thing, we actually see like where it would make more sense in this encounter, because if we play the game where Marco's using dur negation, King would be dripping blood from his mouth, so he'd be kind of spitting up blood from an internal wound, where it would make sense that blood would be coming out of his mask in that kind of scenario, as opposed to we don't see the wound with Zoro and Sanji, we don't see blood dripping from any place, and we don't see a reaction from King that constitutes him actually being in some kind of danger or taking some kind of damage. These attacks are having some effect to a point where Marco is dominating the two of them and is able to go back and forth between the two and corral them whenever they try to dip away. So the attack having no effect on King doesn't seem to make any sense, and why would he not be able to immediately kick right back into the fight? So why would King just simply allow, you know, Marco to be stopping both him and Queen from doing their objectives? Doesn't make a lot of sense. There's also a way you can interpret that even if theoretically he couldn't physically bypass the durability, you could still theoretically rattle someone's brain to knock them unconscious from their reverberations, especially if he's using shockwaves, where it'd be a situation where repeated concussions could just eventually lead to somebody's death. If you believe that Marco has dur negation via shockwaves, dur negation is just that it negates durability, so therefore any durability that you have shouldn't matter. So if he has dur negation, he has a way to damage King regardless. Now, to the extent is going to be what's in question, but for this premise, it's more of a situation where I would say, given the fact that he's faster than King, shown to us, at least in flame on form, at best you're going to say that King, when he goes into his flame on mode, would get to relativity with Marco speed wise, but even that's kind of in question. So let's just say like, hey, he's going to need to use that speed form to contend with Marco. now he is more vulnerable to taking damage from Marco. One thing that people don't understand is that it's almost just as difficult for King to take down Marco as it would be for Marco to take down King, because Marco's regeneration, which is tied directly to his stamina. So it's a situation where if he comes into this fight fresh, he doesn't have all the fatigue he had previously had, which I documented at the beginning of the video, and is shown to be faster than King, at least in his durability form. It's going to be a scenario where he's not really going to need to be regenning wounds. He's not going to have the expenditure of damage, all that there, and he's already faster, so he doesn't even have to fucking use the ability. So the timeline would simply just be almost moot, and I would say that it would favor Marco in a battle of chip damage, where he would eventually just chip King out. Especially if you think that he is able to at least affect the Dura form, he's definitely going to be able to damage the flame form. If you really wanted to get into the weeds on things, you could actually say that when Kizaru and Marco fight, we know 100% now that, you know, Kizaru can fly, he can move in the air, pretty much the exact same ability he has on the ground. Marco was able to kick Kizaru out of the sky, and this is while Kizaru is blocking the attack. Kizaru against Luffy, he's able to maintain his aerial position while Luffy barrages him with Gear 5 punches. Interesting. So you could even argue that Marco, with that kick that was built up, had more power than just, like, you know, a basic Gatling from Luffy in the air, at least to a point where he could overwhelm Kizaru's defense in that moment, if you wanted to argue that. You could kind of try to contest that by saying, well, when he's blocking the Gatling, he's kind of using his palms, which is synonymous with his advanced armament haki. Potentially that might not be available to him from his forearm, although I don't see why it necessarily wouldn't, especially given that you kind of see the same thing where Kizaru seems to be using this on all his points of his body, where he's blocking Gear 4 attacks with his knee, elbows, etc. And then you also have a situation where it's like, was Kizaru just tactically retreating there? Because obviously, you know, when the explosion happened and he landed, you know, he was completely fine. Like, people thought he could have been hurt, but he was already responding saying, hey, watch for aerial attacks. So it almost could be seen as a troll, especially given the dialogue where he's like, oh, that hurt, and then Marco's calling him a liar. It is interesting, though, to say, like, hey, why is Kizaru just surrendering that position in the air? Does he need to? If you want to argue that, Marco's got some pretty decent force on his kicks, at least, which I think would be consistent anyway. Like, he's bullying these two all across the map. It's not just like they're getting knocked down marginally. They're getting sent flying by Marco. Not to mention, he briefly stopped Akainu's punch in Marineford, supposed to boast some of the highest defensive capabilities, and was able to overpower Big Mom in a clash. Like, yeah, you can talk about the special properties of the flame, but Big Mom is punching behind Prometheus. She is putting physical force behind that punch, and yet Marco still wins the clash. So his physical force is nothing to scoff at. Obviously, we get a limited sample size, but we see Marco being able to manhandle King and Queen together, pull them in, overpower them, throw them around, kick them through the walls, all these kinds of things, where those guys are not able to hold their ground, and they never actually get a moment where they're able to clash on even footing with Marco. I mean, with that said, I think it's obvious that he definitely has enough force to inflict massive amount of damage to flame off King. The problem is just this flame on. And if you look at what I'm explaining to you, and you go back and you understand context clues, you understand the reasons characters have these reactions where King's face is very worried. In both those instances where Marco's about to unload a serious attack on him, those do not indicate somebody that is not concerned about what's going to hit him. I don't think that they have the force to obviously beat him, but they have the force to where they're affecting the guy. The hits are mounting on King at that point. Even if you look at the panel where, you know, the blood droplets are coming down, the purpose of this panel is to showcase that, like, King and Queen have both taken damage. They're both frustrated. Like, Queen's holding his head, King's eyes are closed. These things are important. But I think Marco is vastly downplayed, and honestly, for me, I would take Marco in this fight 100%. So I think it's a high diff fight, you know, given the stats that each possess, but I would definitely take Marco winning due to chip damage in the end. Especially if you constitute that the characters are going to fight in character. You see that King even uses his speed form against somebody that's not even showcasing a threat AP wise early on in the fight, Zoro. So in character, if he's in a 1v1 fight with Marco, he would be using his speed form to amplify force on his attacks, and also to contend with Marco, especially given that Marco's faster than him, he's going to need to. Let me know what you guys think. Comment below, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.